There's a man at the center of this entire crisis who has barely said a word in public since the war began. No press conferences, no speeches to the nation, no dramatic statements broadcast around the world. While Iran's supreme leader was assassinated, while Trump was posting threats on Truth Social, while the Strait of Hormuz opened and closed like a malfunctioning valve, while the global economy shook, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the most powerful man in the Arab world, sat quietly in his palaces in Riyadh, watching, calculating, and playing one of the most audacious, dangerous, and consequential double games in the modern history of Middle Eastern geopolitics. What MBS has done since February 28, 2026, is so layered, so contradictory, so simultaneously brilliant and reckless, that even the officials inside the Washington national security establishment who watch him most closely are struggling to fully categorize what they are seeing. He privately lobbied Trump to start the war. He privately urged Trump to send ground troops into Iran to seize its oil fields. He publicly called for peace and diplomacy. He secretly prepositioned Saudi oil production to profit from the Hormuz disruption he helped engineer. His own infrastructure was hit by more than 575 Iranian strikes. And then, on April 14th, he publicly broke with Washington's maximum pressure strategy and told America to end the blockade and negotiate. All of this from the same man in the span of 6 weeks. And Washington, which thought it understood what MBS wanted, is looking at the full picture and realizing it only understood part of it. Let us go through every layer of this, because what MBS has done is not just unusual, it is a masterclass in strategic ambiguity that will be studied for decades. Start where everything starts. Before February 28th, before the bombs fell, before Khamenei was killed, before the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Because the question of who actually wanted this war and who pushed hardest to make it happen is the foundation on which everything else rests. President Donald Trump launched the wide-ranging attack on Iran after a weeks-long lobbying effort by an unusual pair of U.S. allies in the Middle East, Israel and Saudi Arabia, according to 4 people familiar with the matter. Israel's role is not surprising. Netanyahu had been pushing for military action against Iran for years, but Saudi Arabia, the country that in 2023 sat across a table from Iran in Beijing and shook hands on a diplomatic normalization deal, the country that publicly said, repeatedly and loudly, that it supported a peaceful resolution. That country was, according to the Washington Post and confirmed across multiple outlets, privately lobbying Trump to pull the trigger. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made multiple private phone calls to Trump over the past month, advocating a U.S. attack, despite his public support for a diplomatic solution. Multiple phone calls, advocating a U.S. attack, while publicly supporting diplomacy. This is not a minor contradiction. This is an almost perfectly crafted policy of public denial and private instigation. MBS wanted the war. He just did not want anyone to know he wanted it. And then, in early April, as the war entered its 4th week and the U.S.-Israel air campaign was grinding into new phases, the New York Times reported something that went even further than the initial lobbying. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman privately urged President Donald Trump to deploy American ground troops inside Iran and seize the country's energy infrastructure, according to people briefed on the conversations. The reported calls describe MBS framing the war as a historic opportunity to eliminate the threat Iran poses to Saudi Arabia and its Gulf neighbors. Ground troops inside Iran, seizing energy infrastructure. This is not advising an ally to maintain military pressure. This is lobbying for an invasion, for regime change, for the permanent military occupation of another country's oil fields. MBS was telling Trump to do something that would be legally classified as a war of aggression under international law, something that multiple senior U.S. officials and legal scholars said would require explicit new congressional authorization, something that even many of the hawks inside the Trump administration were reluctant to support. According to American sources cited by the New York Times during several conversations, the Crown Prince pressed Trump on the need to go as far as destroying the Iranian regime, which he considers a long-term threat to Gulf countries. Mohammed bin Salman also reportedly encouraged strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure to weaken the regime and raise the possibility of ground operations, including seizing strategic sites such as Karg Island, a key hub for Iranian oil exports. Karg Island, the terminal through which 90% of Iran's oil exports flow. MBS was telling Trump to seize it. Think about what that means. If the United States were to seize Karg Island, Iran's primary source of oil export revenue would be gone. The IRGC's funding, the regime's ability to pay soldiers and bureaucrats, the economic oxygen that keeps the Islamic Republic alive, all of it flows through Karg. And MBS was on the phone to Trump saying, take it. Because if the United States takes Karg Island, the permanent balance of power in the Persian Gulf shifts in ways that benefit Saudi Arabia for decades. Iran's oil is gone. Saudi Arabia's oil remains. Saudi Arabia becomes the indispensable energy power in the region, not a competitor to a nuclear-armed Persian rival, but the unchallenged dominant supplier to every market that mattered. And then notice what happened simultaneously on the Saudi domestic level. Because while MBS was privately pushing Trump toward maximum escalation, Saudi Arabia's state-aligned media was doing something very different. Saudi Arabia's official diplomacy, expressed through its foreign ministry, its embassy in Washington, and its state-aligned media, was consistent support for diplomatic resolution. The Saudi government's public position was peace. Its crown prince's private position was invasion. This is not miscommunication. This is deliberate strategic architecture. But here is where MBS's plan ran into something he had not fully accounted for. Iran fought back, not just at Israel and American military bases, at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia absorbed more than 575 Iranian drone and missile strikes since the war began, according to tracking by the Saudi Ministry of Defense. 575 strikes on Saudi territory, on Saudi infrastructure, on the economy that MBS has staked his entire legacy on. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery on the Gulf Coast was struck by drones on March 2nd, causing a temporary halt in operation. The massive Sheba oil field in eastern Saudi Arabia near the UAE border, the Jubail petrochemical complex, and the Samref refinery in Yanbu, 50-50 owned by ExxonMobil, were all attacked. And then the most strategically devastating strike of all, the one that hit the thing MBS had been counting on most. The 200-kilometer east-west oil pipeline in Saudi Arabia, known as Petroline, was attacked only hours after a 2-week ceasefire was supposed to be in place on April 8th, with damage to a pumping station along the route. The Saudi press agency confirmed the damage resulted in a loss of about 700,000 barrels per day, the east-west pipeline. This is Saudi Arabia's insurance policy against Hormuz disruption. It was built during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, specifically so that Saudi Arabia could export its oil to the Red Sea and bypass the Persian Gulf choke point entirely. It has a capacity of 7 million barrels per day. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia boosted throughput through Petroline, positioning itself as a partial substitute supplier to global markets and collecting the price premium that comes with being one of the only functioning export routes in the region. And Iran hit it, knocked out 700,000 barrels per day of capacity, hit the thing MBS had built his entire wartime economic strategy around. Production in Saudi Arabia, OPEC's biggest producer, dropped 23% from 10.1 million barrels per day to 7.8 million barrels per day. Overall, OPEC's production plunged 27% month over month from 28.7 million barrels per day to 20.8 million barrels per day, a 23% drop in Saudi production in 1 month. Saudi Aramco, the company that is the financial backbone of the entire Saudi state, lost nearly a quarter of its output capacity because of a war that MBS helped engineer and that Iran responded to by targeting the kingdom's most valuable economic assets. Now, understand what this means for Vision 2030, because this is where MBS's double game started to become genuinely dangerous for his own country. Vision 2030 requires stability. Saudi Arabia is in the middle of a decade-long economic transformation. NEOM, the Red Sea tourism development, the sports and entertainment investments, the sovereign wealth fund diversification, all of it requires foreign investment, international business presence, and a Gulf region that global capital is willing to enter. A regional war with an active U.S. naval blockade spooks every category of investor. The longer the conflict runs, the more Saudi Arabia's non-oil economic agenda gets delayed. MBS has a 2030 deadline that he has publicly committed to delivering. The entire global reputation of Saudi Arabia as a place where foreign capital is safe, where mega projects get built, where international business wants to operate, all of it depends on the Gulf being a stable environment that investors are willing to enter. A war with Iran firing 575 strikes at Saudi territory, with oil production down 23%, with the Petroline pumping station damaged, with international airlines rerouting away from Gulf airspace, is the worst possible environment for attracting the trillions in foreign direct investment that Vision 2030 requires. MBS got the war he wanted and found out the war he wanted was eating his most important non-military strategic objective alive. And then Trump did something that nobody, including the Saudis, saw coming. He went to the Future Investment Initiative Conference in Miami, an event organized by MBS's own public investment fund, and publicly humiliated the Crown Prince. The 2026 version of the relationship abandoned the pretense. Trump was not defending MBS from external criticism. He was generating the criticism himself and doing it on Saudi soil using Saudi money at a Saudi event. The transition from important ally to a relationship framed as transactional dependence was not a rhetorical accident. It reflects a structural reclassification of the most transactional alliance in modern history. Trump's public framing of Saudi Arabia as a country that is dependent on American protection, made at a conference Saudi Arabia was hosting and paying for, was not just an insult to MBS personally. It was a public statement about the asymmetry of the relationship at the very moment that asymmetry was most visible, because the war had made Saudi Arabia's military dependency on America nakedly obvious to the entire world. Saudi forces had consumed roughly half to two-thirds of Lockheed Martin's annual production output in 16 days of intercepting Iranian strikes. Replenishment at the current production rate of 650 units per year means the kingdom cannot replace what it has already fired until well into 2027. Saudi Arabia, the richest per capita country in the Gulf region, which has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on American weapons systems over decades, fired through half to two-thirds of an entire year's worth of Lockheed Martin's Patriot missile production in 16 days of defending itself against Iranian strikes, and cannot replace those interceptors until 2027 at the earliest. Without the American weapons, the American maintenance crews, the American satellite targeting data, and the American operational expertise embedded throughout the Saudi military, the kingdom's air defense network would have been overwhelmed weeks ago. Trump was publicly saying what everyone in the room already knew, but nobody was supposed to say out loud. Saudi Arabia does not defend itself. America defends Saudi Arabia. And America's patience for doing that for free is not unlimited. This is the context in which MBS made his most extraordinary public move. Saudi Arabia publicly broke with Washington's maximum pressure approach on April 14, 2026, and called for negotiations. Saudi Arabia just publicly told the United States to end its Hormuz blockade and negotiate with Iran. Saudi Arabia, the country that has been fighting a proxy war against Iranian influence in Yemen, that relies on the U.S. security umbrella, that activated its East-West pipeline specifically to bypass a Hormuz disruption, publicly broke with Washington. Let that sit for a moment. The man who privately lobbied Trump to bomb Iran, the man who privately urged ground troops to seize Iranian oil fields, the man whose country's official position for months was that Iran represented an existential threat requiring decisive military action. That man's government publicly told Washington to end its naval blockade and negotiate on April 14th, less than 7 weeks after the war that he helped start began. April 14th, 2026 is the day the U.S. coalition visibly fractured. In the same 24-hour window, Saudi Arabia urged end to blockade and negotiations. Pakistan proposed hosting a second round of talks. Spain called on China to use its influence to end the war. None of these countries is Iran's ally. All of them are either formal U.S. allies or strategic partners. All of them are publicly calling for a different approach than the blockade. The last time a comparable pattern emerged was the Iraq War in 2003, when France, Germany, and much of the non-Anglophone Western world refused to participate. Iraq, 2003, the comparison that no American administration ever once applied to its war. The last time American allies lined up publicly to say, "We are with you in principle, but not in practice," this particular approach has gone too far. And the Saudi move was the most significant of all, because Saudi Arabia is not France or Germany. Saudi Arabia is the country that hosts American military bases, that buys American weapons, that has the most at stake in Iran's permanent regional defeat. If Saudi Arabia is telling Washington to stop the blockade and negotiate, it is not a statement of anti-American sentiment. It is a statement that the man running Saudi Arabia has concluded that the war as currently being prosecuted has become more dangerous to Saudi Arabia's interests than a negotiated outcome would be. MBS's preferred endgame: managed de-escalation with Iran frozen at current enrichment levels but not dismantled, blockade suspended, the 2023 normalization deal preserved. Not an Iranian defeat, not an Iranian nuclear weapon. This is the key. MBS does not want Iran destroyed. He wants Iran contained, permanently weakened, prevented from nuclear breakout, stripped of its proxy network, but he does not want the Islamic Republic to collapse into a chaos that would produce something worse. He does not want a failed state on the northern shore of the Persian Gulf with no central government capable of controlling 70 million people, its enriched uranium stockpile, and its IRGC factions. He does not want the Shia-Sunni sectarian tensions of an Iranian state collapse spilling across the Gulf. And he absolutely does not want a war that continues long enough for Iran to decide that Saudi oil infrastructure is the most effective lever of pain it has left. If the conflict intensifies under the blockade, and Iran decides it needs to demonstrate capability against the U.S. coalition more broadly, Saudi infrastructure is the highest value target in the region. MBS wants the conflict over before Iran decides to hit something it hasn't hit yet. The 2019 Aramco attack on Abqaiq and Khurais was a demonstration. Iranian drones and cruise missiles flew hundreds of kilometers and hit the processing facilities that handle about 5% of global daily oil supply. It caused a brief global price spike and showed Saudi Arabia exactly what Iran could do if it chose to escalate against Saudi infrastructure. And that was before the current war. Now, Iran has less to lose. Now, Iran's leadership has been assassinated and replaced. Now, Iran's economy is being strangled by an American naval blockade. Now Iran's IRGC factions are fighting for control of the country's strategic direction without a supreme leader capable of reining them in. A desperate cornered Iran with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous version of Iran. And Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq facility, its Ras Tanura terminal, its desalination plants that provide drinking water to millions, all of them are within range. MBS emphasized that Saudi Arabia would not allow its territory or airspace to be used for military actions against Iran. This statement, buried in the diplomatic record, is more significant than most people realized when it was first made, because the American air campaign against Iran has been conducted partially from bases on and around the Arabian Peninsula. If Saudi Arabia withdraws the use of its airspace and territory, it does not just complicate American logistics, it potentially makes certain strike packages impossible. MBS has quietly signaled that his patience for the war being prosecuted from Saudi soil is not unlimited. And then there is the thing that MBS is not talking about publicly, but that every analyst in the region is paying close attention to. The 2023 China brokered deal. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations in a deal brokered by China. That normalization was a strategic investment by MBS, reducing the two-front threat environment that had kept Saudi Arabia in a constant defensive posture across the region. The Iran war has put that investment at risk. Saudi Arabia does not want to be seen as a belligerent party to a war against a country it normalized with 36 months ago. 36 months. 3 years. After sitting across a table from Iran in Beijing and agreeing to restore diplomatic ties, Saudi Arabia finds itself being framed by Iran's government and by Iranian state media as a co-belligerent in the war. The IRGC has been openly accusing Saudi Arabia of providing the political cover and the base access that allowed Washington to act. The Saudi denial is formal, but the sourcing on MBS's private phone calls to Trump is extensive, confirmed across multiple publications, and the Iranian government treats it as settled fact, regardless of what Riyadh says officially. The 2023 normalization deal, which represented a genuine strategic investment in regional stability, is in jeopardy because Iran cannot separate the country that publicly said it supported diplomacy from the country that privately lobbied for war. The IRGC-affiliated media outlet described MBS's reported push for regime change as confirmation that Riyadh is America's client, not its partner, and warned that any Saudi participation in ground operations on Iranian soil would make every Saudi city a legitimate military target. Every Saudi city, 45 million people, Riyadh, Jeddah, Mecca, Medina, the spiritual heartland of Sunni Islam within range of Iranian ballistic missiles that have already demonstrated they can reach Saudi infrastructure with precision. MBS took a calculated risk when he lobbied Trump to strike. The calculation was that the strike would be so decisive, so overwhelming, so definitively lethal to Iran's military capability that Iran would not be able to mount a coherent retaliatory campaign. That calculation is proven partially wrong. Iran's military has been devastated, but not destroyed. Its missile capability has been degraded, but not eliminated. And its new leadership, lacking the stabilizing authority of Ali Khamenei, is less predictable, less controllable, and less deterred by the escalation risks that the old regime would have calculated with cold precision. Word among the leaders in the Gulf states, like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was that Israel would attack sooner or later. They had knocked out most, if not all, of Iran's air defenses last June. This was an opportunity to really destroy and defeat the system itself and topple the regime. The surprise, really, was more to do with timing, and also the fact that the Americans were all in. The Americans being all in was the variable MBS had not fully anticipated in its political consequences. Because when America is all in on a war, Trump wants everyone to be all in with America. And when they are not, he says so publicly, loudly, and in the most humiliating way possible. Trump's response to Allied dissent in this conflict has been the courage or will framing, publicly humiliating allies for not participating militarily. MBS built his entire foreign policy around the idea that Saudi Arabia could play multiple sides simultaneously, deepening the American security relationship while expanding economic ties with China and Russia, joining BRICS, normalizing with Iran, pursuing Vision 2030 investments from every corner of the world, without being forced to choose. Trump's war has forced a choice, and the choice it has forced is visible in the gap between what MBS says privately and what he says publicly, a gap that is now so large and so well documented that even his closest allies cannot fully defend it. The coordination signal, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan both moved on April 14th, suggesting back-channel coordination on creating diplomatic space for a second round of negotiations before April 22nd, back-channel coordination. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan working together in the background, trying to create the conditions for a deal before the ceasefire expires and the bombs return. MBS is not just expressing a preference for negotiations. He's actively helping to engineer them, sending Pakistan to Tehran with new messages, urging the Americans to ease pressure, trying to construct a landing zone for a deal that ends the war at a point that serves Saudi Arabia's interests, not Iran's complete restoration, not Iran's complete destruction, something in between that Saudi Arabia can live with. Saudi Arabia seems to be the net winner after MBS's recent trip to Washington. MBS got a long-sought deal on advanced U.S. chips for Saudi Arabia's AI ambitions. He got a strategic defense agreement and was designated a major non-NATO ally. Saudi Arabia was offered the F-35, one of the most sophisticated pieces of hardware in the U.S. arsenal, and signed agreements on critical minerals and civil nuclear cooperation. This is the relationship MBS built before the war, the F-35. Civil nuclear cooperation, major non-NATO ally designation, chip technology access, a strategic defense agreement. Saudi Arabia extracted a remarkable package of concessions from Washington in the months before February 28th, concessions that multiple analysts noted were unusually generous, concessions that look very different in retrospect when you know that the same period was the one in which MBS was privately lobbying Trump to go to war. On normalization with Israel, Trump reportedly believed that because he ended the war in Gaza, the time is right for Saudi Arabia and Israel to move ahead with mutual diplomatic recognition. Publicly, MBS said, "We want to be a part of the Abraham Accords." But he made clear that normalization remains linked to a credible path to statehood for the Palestinians. In other words, the Saudis didn't budge. He took the weapons, he took the chips, he took the nuclear cooperation and the F-35 offer and the major non-NATO ally designation. And he gave back nothing on normalization with Israel, the one thing Trump wanted most. Because MBS understands that normalization with Israel, without a credible Palestinian state pathway, is politically impossible inside the Arab world and personally dangerous for him domestically. He can be seen as America's ally. He cannot be seen as America's instrument for delivering Arab legitimacy to Israeli occupation. This is the MBS pattern. Extract the maximum from the relationship, give back the minimum, do it while maintaining enough ambiguity in your public positions that you can never be fully blamed for the outcome of any policy you supported. He is the man who privately lobbied for the war and publicly called for peace, the man who boosted oil production before the war to profit from the disruption and got his pipeline hit. The man who accepted American weapons and American protection and then publicly told America to change its strategy. The man who called the war a historic opportunity and then watched it damage his economy, his infrastructure, and his 2030 timeline. What MBS just did is insane in the sense that it is multidimensional in a way that defies simple categorization. He is simultaneously a war architect calling for peace, a beneficiary of disruption, absorbing disruption's costs, a dependent American ally, publicly challenging American strategy, and a man who privately wanted regime change and publicly wants managed de-escalation. Washington did not expect this. Washington expected loyalty. It expected that the man who lobbied for the war would support its conduct. It expected that the country receiving American military protection would defer to American strategic judgment. It expected that the largest check-writing relationship in the arms trade would buy at least consistent public support. It got none of those things. Instead, it got a crown prince who treats the American relationship as a transactional arrangement with limits, who extracts what he needs and withholds what he can, who plays every side of every board simultaneously, and then publicly breaks with his patron at the precise moment when the patron most needs solidarity. What MBS just did is the most sophisticated, most dangerous, most consequential piece of geopolitical maneuvering in the Middle East since the 1970s oil embargo, and it is not finished yet. The war is not over. The ceasefire is fragile. The negotiations are continuing, and MBS is still on the phone, still calculating, still telling each party what the party needs to hear. In this war, Mohammed bin Salman did not pick a side. He built a position from which, no matter what happens next, Saudi Arabia walks away with more than it started with, even if he has to publicly embarrass the ally whose bombs he privately demanded to get there.